For this photo study, I'd like to work from one of the photos I took in Heisler at night. So I'm going to be starting off with just a black and white two-tone sketch, but right now I'm going over some of the main compositional elements, and I'm creating guiding lines that already exist in this composition and seeing if I could strategize and plan for a successful composition that points towards a focal point or an area of interest. So right now, I'm drawing out some of the shapes for these rocks in the mid-ground and redesigning them a little bit. You'll see as I start painting this that a lot of the shapes are going to shift and change. They're going to vary in terms of proportion, but in the end, they should all serve the purpose of guiding our eye towards an area of interest, which is going to be those palm trees off, getting that backlight from the city in Laguna Beach. So as always, I try to start off with a horizon line and very simple graphic shapes that can serve as a scaffolding for this process of painting. It doesn't hurt to create some guiding lines, especially if you're not too familiar with creating perspective without these lines. I think it's important to understand where your vanishing points are, where your vanishing points are leading to, because all this type of stuff should give you some insight on how to compose the elements within your scene. I do think that perspective is one of the most important tools, especially for environment design, because once you start inventing and designing environments from scratch, you're really going to have a good foundation of perspective to create scenes in 3D, especially scenes that are very vast and have a lot of atmosphere. You could see there, even for the palm trees, I use very basic spheres, or circles in this case, to block them out. I'm just thinking about the biggest compositional elements and then establishing some sort of tonal pass before I get into color. On one layer, I'm just working into the background, creating this gradient that naturally exists here in the image. It's always a good idea to work from your biggest shapes and elements first, and then break down the smaller ones as you go. One of the benefits of working like this and not zooming in yet is I can look at my reference, I can squint, and I can see the overall impression that the values have. I do notice that there's a dark gradient coming from the bottom up. And right now there's actually a little bit more light value in the sky, but we'll adjust that as we go on. So in the beginning here, I'm trying to be very cognizant of the layers that I have selected and which ones are in the foreground, the background, the midground. Right now, I just have a very basic abbreviation for them inside of my layers. There's even options to change around the color of some of your layers too, so it's a little bit quicker for you to understand exactly what you're working on. If you have some sort of color key, it kind of helps to keep yourself a little bit more organized, especially once your layers get into the hundreds. At this point, I'm going in with some of the darkest darks that I have in my scene. And I'm just designing these shapes very simply. And I can always come back in with a lasso tool or a different brush to create more variation on the silhouette of these objects. This is what's considered as massing. And that's my focus right now, is massing in these large shapes, creating interesting patterns, and really thinking about my composition and where these implied lines and shapes are leading to. It's important to have an overall sense of balance too with my focal point, because I know it's going to be so strong in that top left quadrant. I need to have some other elements that help to balance it out a little bit. So these midground and foreground elements are going to come in hand for that. And if I don't have something in my photo that's working as a counterbalance, I'll always make sure to invent something that's fitting to the scene. Lasso tool is one of my favorite tools, especially with these types of shapes here. It's kind of hard to get these very, very sharp shapes without just drawing them in with a lasso tool. All right, so now that we have a lot of our foreground established with those sharper shapes that we have, and notice that they're a little bit darker as well, we want to have that subtlety of value going back in atmosphere. We have our darkest values typically closest to us, and that means usually at the bottom of the picture frame. And then as things get back farther into the atmosphere, they're going to increase in value. They're going to have a little bit more of that lighter tone included in them. So you'll see me actually approach this later on. So right now I'm working on some of the secondary details like those trees in the background, but I'm still keeping them pretty simple. I want to make sure that the shapes are readable and they're designed well enough that they have good enough small, medium, and large shapes. I always think about patterns and how I can create different variations that echo the same shapes that you see in nature. I always try to stray away from too much like symmetry. I usually favor more asymmetry when it comes to doing these types of landscape designs. You'll keep seeing me use a lot of this marquee tool, especially for some of these waves that are coming into perspective here. It's a pretty useful tool. And even if the perspective isn't perfect, you can use this transform tool like I'm doing right here and shift the perspective to actually work with the type of scene that you have. You can contort the objects to actually vanish to the according vanishing points that you have in the scene. So here I'm using the polygonal lasso tool to work with that perspective. And I'm trying to think about that vanishing line off in the distance there. So when I'm doing these quick studies, I'll typically jump back and forth within the composition because sometimes I'll take a step back and I'll notice that some areas need to be emphasized a little bit more. At a certain stage, I will add more atmosphere, and in certain areas, I'll start to include more of the focal points to get an idea of how that would look in the finish. But a lot of it comes down to jumping back and forth and balancing things out, especially when you're at this stage and you're using smaller brushes and getting into those secondary and even tertiary details. And when I talk about tertiary details, I mean a lot of the smaller details, like right here, I'm using a little bit more texture and getting this breakup in noise that's really small. And I would consider this tertiary. Your textures, your small details, all the subtlety, that's stuff you want to consider a later in your painting, but sometimes I'll include it here just to get an idea of what that might look like as a finish. Again, this is the beauty of separating your layers and having things a little bit organized because as you saw there, I was just working inside of the pixels for those rocks in the midground and just painting in a darker value and adjusting things as I go. It's all non-destructive. I have the ability to move around the pixels that I need to. I can paint behind the pixels that I want to. And to me, this creates a sense of logic to where I know where things are. And in my mind, this is a three-dimensional painting. And I'm treating my layers the same way. I have the foreground elements separated, the midground, background, the lights, the gradient in the sky, and even the waves.